In this episode of the Omega Podcast, we are joined by the esteemed founder of Adaptive Leadership Strategies, LLC. As an executive coach, leadership strategist, and author, Brenda works with leaders to develop the professional habits and strategic mindset necessary to achieve both individual and organizational success.
Welcome to the Omega Podcast with Brenda Harrington, the founder of Adaptive Leadership Strategies, an executive coach, leadership strategist, and author. She helps leaders to develop the professional habits necessary for them to achieve individual and organizational success. Brenda, it is such a pleasure to have you on the Omega Podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Keenan.
Absolutely. And I know you have such an incredible tenure in your field, but most importantly, you have been such a trailblazer in the marketplace, especially founding Adaptive Leadership Strategies. To get our conversation kickstarted, can you share with our audience a little bit more about your story of starting Adaptive Leadership Strategies?
Sure. When I envisioned Adaptive Leadership Strategies, it was during what we think of as the financial crisis, right, back in 2008. And I was leading a senior leadership team through a very challenging acquisition. And that's when I really learned a lot more about interventions such as executive coaching and some of the things that we had used minimally. But in a situation that we were in, we really had to lean on them, rely on them a lot more. And what I realized was that once you focus on the people part and you can get that right, amazing things can happen, right? We were in the worst of circumstances, as many people would describe it, at a very challenging time in our external environment because of what was going on, worldwide. And so I decided at that point, that's how I wanted to spend not just a portion of my time, but all of my time. And so I was, about to think about what I wanted this last professional chapter to be for me, if you will. And I decided to go back and get, the requisite certifications and, learn, how to be a coach initially, right? I had benefited from coaching, certainly. And that's a short story about how we got started.
Fantastic. And I think what really resonated with me is that you took the necessary steps to acknowledge you're in the latter half of your career, as you mentioned, and you're looking to create the most impact, right? How do you really zone in all your skill sets and abilities to really help other individuals reach their full potential? And I really appreciate you sharing that, especially when it comes to coaching. You've mentioned in the past and from work that you've done with Omega a few years ago with the Omega Author Talks in your incredible book launch, that you've spent a lot of time with senior leaders, executives, coaching them, mentoring them in different capacities. My question for you, Brenda, is why do many leaders reach a point where their existing leadership practices stop producing the same level of impact? It could be across, their financial bottom line. It can be their impact in the organization. What have you seen across your tenure that has helped and also may have hurt other executives in that particular area?
Well, I've certainly seen it over the years, but it is amplified and magnified now. Very little is the same today as it was yesterday, right? And so, we hear this term lifelong learning, which some people may think of as being cliche, but I will say, if you are in the business environment and especially in a leadership role, you've got to be committed to continuing to learn. I hear a lot of people say, I learned that when I was in grad school 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Oh, I did this back then. Well, that's lovely, but it has very little relevance to what we're experiencing now. And so if people continue to reach back for the best practices and the tried and true approaches that they used, 2-3 years ago, I used to say 5 years ago, but I'll say 2 or 3 months ago now, right? It's probably not going to work for them entirely, right? And so people have got to be willing to kind of zoom out and really reflect on what's happening, pay attention to trends. And sometimes that means questioning themselves, right? Second guessing and asking tough questions about their approach and what they might do differently. And you can see a difference, when people are committed to that and they treat leadership as a practice, and not as a place where they've arrived. It's not a destination. right? There's ongoing work that is required if you're in a leadership role.
Yeah, and that definitely brings up a very critical point when it comes to those self-reflection, right? I love how you talked about asking those tough questions earlier on and being able to acknowledge the areas of opportunities that leaders should be able to begin to develop, right? Being able to look at their strengths, their weaknesses, and then their opportunities, almost as if they're the organization themselves and they're doing that internal SWOT analysis.
Totally. Yeah. And you touch on something very important, being willing to look at it. For a lot of people that elicits fear, it makes them question their relevance. They feel as though they failed. And there's nothing wrong with saying, I don't know, or I need more information. Leaders now are tasked with making much more challenging decisions with a lot less information, right? And so they've really got to practice their skills around being flexible and nimble and adaptable, and, just not relying on this linear approach to things. And for some people, that's very uncomfortable. It's very frightening. But in the leadership space now, Keenan, we talk a lot about getting comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yes, for certain. And I think we're in an age with the rapid development of artificial intelligence, tech advancement. A lot of companies are looking into different approaches to how they can engage their existing employee workforce. I mean, the types of ways that leaders have to adapt is at a very rapid pace, almost to a point that it's unprecedented, right?
I think it is unprecedented. Certainly if you think about, changes that have taken hold over the years, it's all relative, right? I can think about when, we were embracing the internet and the impact that had and things like that. But this is a lot different because it's hitting on so many different dimensions. And I think, even the people who are at the forefront of AI development don't fully understand the impact that it can have.
For sure. I mean, based upon your experience, what would you say separates leaders who evolve consistently from those who plateau?
The ones who are willing to learn, the ones who keep an open mind, who proceed with curiosity, and who are willing to ask questions and not assume that they have all of the answers. Nobody can have all the answers, right? And so, if we crack the spine on the book actually entitled The Practice of Adaptive Leadership, by Heifetz out of Harvard, he talks about, treating the space as a leadership laboratory, right? As a learning laboratory. And you almost have to look at it that way. You can't assume that you have all the answers and that you know how to solve all the problems.
Yes. And I think that's a very important approach that you're sharing, is being able to acknowledge your whereabouts and where you don't have those answers. But as we both know, being leaders, sometimes there's this expectation that we have to have all the answers. If not, from the outside perspective, that if we don't have the answers, we can be perceived as inconsistent, or in some instances may not be reliable to those that are our stakeholders or our employees. But based upon your role at Adaptive Leadership Strategies, what are some ways that you have walked executives through that process for them to acknowledge those areas of weaknesses, or if you want to put it, to be able to acknowledge that they don't have the answers? And how are you able to walk them through a framework or a process to enable them to, answer those internal questions? That way they can be a better impact to their organization.
Part of it is reframing and getting out in front of it, right? Not having the answers is not a weakness. It's just not possible. And so, people first have to, reframe their way of thinking, change their mindset about what it means to lead. It's not to know how to do everything and to do everything yourself. It's to be able to amass and organize the resources that you need to get things done, right? It's about, really being strategic in how you move things forward. And that's a whole different conversation, right? And so leaders really need to be willing to distance themselves from activities of management and certainly activities of individual contributors. And that's hard for people to do because that's for many people, not all, but for many people, that's how they came up through, the ranks, if you will, right? They started as individual contributors or subject matter experts, and they got really, really good at their discipline and their technical and core competencies. It has nothing to do with being a leader, okay? It has nothing to do with it. And so people first have to make the distinction between what they used to do and what they're now there to do. And then I think you have to set the expectations. So if you assume responsibility for a team, for example, and, they're expecting you to have all the answers, right? That's the way they're going to proceed. And so I think you have to be very explicit about the expectations. There might be people on the team, there will likely be, who know more about, a number of things than the leader does. And that's fine. So you develop and grow, nurture and grow, that person and help them apply those competencies. It's not a threat, right? And so we really have to focus on the mindset, getting leaders to think differently about why they're there and what they're there to do.
Absolutely. And I think what we're touching upon today is not necessarily an easy path for a leader to take, because as you mentioned earlier on, leaders have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. My question then is, what role does discomfort play in leadership growth? And why do so many leaders avoid it?
Because it hurts. It's, it doesn't feel good. And for some, it really impedes their ability to build confidence, right? How can I feel confident and self-assured if I don't know the answer, right? Or if I don't know what's coming, or if I can't anticipate this? That's the reality of where you are. That's the reality of where we are. So you've got to really shift your thinking around, what that is. And so, unfortunately, when people are uncomfortable, they revert to former, practices or solutions or whatever it is that really don't fit the bill. They are not the solutions that they should be seeking to address a particular issue, right? And there's a lot of research behind that, the impact of that, just not moving in the right direction to address problems.
Right. I know when it comes to change specifically, there's different terms that come to mind, change management, there could be change in behaviors, there could be change in organizational structures, but I think the jarring part to change is that sometimes leaders don't view it as a necessity that's going to impact the bottom line. Is there any way to leaders that are listening right now that you can debunk that thought process, that they feel as though because of my existing behavior or how I'm approaching my leadership strategy doesn't necessarily impact the bottom line for the business?
Anyone who is in a high visibility position is going to have an impact on the business. It's not passive, whether they think they do or not, right? And, a big part of a leader's responsibility, duty, I will say, is to initiate change when it's warranted, right? And so by not doing that, you're really almost setting the team and the organization up for failure, right? Just imagine if a leader said, and hopefully this is extreme at this point, it may not have been 2 or 3 years ago, but if a leader said, we're not going to bother with that AI stuff, we're just going to continue to do what we've been doing, right? And we have examples of this over the years, without getting into a lot of detail, but think about some of the, what we used to refer to as blue chips from many years ago, we don't even hear about it anymore. Look at what happened to Kodak, to IBM, to, so many companies that just kind of rested on their laurels. General Motors, you've got to change. You've got to be willing to adapt and evolve. And if you're not, then maybe it's time to go play golf or something.
Yeah, or to retire or to move on to that next chapter. As I shared prior, change is such a very fluid term, because change could also sound like you got to innovate, right? You got to stay up to date with the new technology, the new ways in which things are being done, improving processes, improving efficiency metrics, et cetera. I mean, to distinguish between a company that's looking to innovate versus one that's trying to change, when we're talking about change management, how does a leader approach distinguishing that, right? Do we need to innovate, or do we need to change, our approach to our leadership style and approach to how we're engaging with everyone part of the company, right?
I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Innovation and creativity are at the top of the list for requisite leadership competencies in 2026. Okay, they just are. And so, a lot of people don't think of themselves as creatives, right? But now is the time for everybody to build that muscle and sharpen and hone those skills, right? And so when you talk about, change and innovation, it all goes together. You can design and implement all kinds of change initiatives, but nothing happens without people and teams. All right. So it really begins not only with the work that you're asking them to do, but more with their buy-in. The environment that we're in is tough on people, even more so than the leaders at the top. OK, and so the first thing most leaders need to do is get that commitment, get that buy-in, and really, I won't say put their teams at ease, but get them to a point that they're not distracted by all of the volatility and uncertainty, right? So that they can perform at their best. And that's difficult when literally everything around you is changing. I'm sure you've heard, people say, well, once we're fully staffed and once this happens, then things will calm down. None of that. OK. And I think that you're doing a disservice if that's the messaging, right? You've got to help people prepare, for this kind of white knuckle ride. And when you're not doing that, you really are mitigating their ability and their opportunity to show up in a meaningful way.
Enjoying this episode of the Omega Podcast? We'd love to hear from you. Please share your thoughts or feedback in the comments. You can also check out omegaconsulting.online for more resources, insights, and industry updates. Now, let's get back to the exciting conversation.
For sure. It's like helping the people prepare. And there's a lot of preparation across multiple industries and verticals. And I know that can reign extremely deep to anyone, especially in this very volatile time we're living in. But to our leaders, or maybe even someone who's in the process of being promoted, right? This is a big promotion season for a lot of companies where they're stepping into a new role of leadership, new team, new dynamics. I mean, what advice would you give those types of leaders that have this larger responsibility, right, in this volatile environment? How do they help translate, the encouragement, the training, and the support to those beneath them or at a lower ranking in the company structure, but also have the understanding and the ability to communicate to the board members, right, to the executive leaders that are overseeing them, right? Because they're kind of being pulled in two different directions, but to still maintain that balance, right?
Well, there are a couple different questions in there. I will say that for someone who is moving into a larger role, it really is important to get clarity as much as possible around expectations, both when you look up, when you look down, and certainly when you look out. And unfortunately, a lot of people find themselves in that situation without the requisite development and, in some cases, training. And so depending on the resources that are available to them through their employer, there may be other things that they need to focus on. And I don't think there's any better investment, than to, seek the types of support, whether it be coaching or leadership development program or leadership or change management certification, depending on what their circumstances are, to do this on their own. Because I think a lot of people take for granted, well, okay, I'll get in there and I'll, kind of learn as I go. We don't have that kind of time. We just do not have that kind of time.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned something that some people really understand is time is not on their side. Right? Time is of the essence, if anything, right? You have to really make very critical decisions in real time, very swiftly and accurately. If not, it's going to impact people at a greater scale and everything. Exactly. I mean, when we talk about leadership as a whole, right? We talked about growth, we talked about change management, but what is the hardest truth leaders have to accept about themselves in order to grow, right? And well, this is the second question, but I think growth is a very broad term. But could you clarify, what does growth mean? Because growth can mean, increasing bottom line, increasing quotas, right, from a financial perspective, but from the internal side, right? Yeah.
So you're talking about external growth when you're talking about increasing, bottom line and all those things.
Yeah.
But internally, I really think it is about maybe letting go of some things that no longer served you. They may have served you well over a long period of time, and you may have relied on them for successes in other environments or, in different times. But now you need to do something else, right? Now you need to take a different approach. And again, a lot of people see that as failure, where, in fact, it's really evolution. So as you approach your 2.0, I'm not saying that you abandon your beliefs and your values, right? You are who you are, but it might be time to take on a different approach and try some new things that are going to be unfamiliar, uncomfortable, might be a little frightening, right? But it's about how you make that connection with the people that you need to line up behind you and to line up with you. If you don't have the people there, you're not leading anything. Okay. So without the followers, right? Without the people with you, it's an empty space.
Yeah. And I'm so grateful you mentioned that it's not a journey that you're taking alone, that there's other people that you're responsible for that are following you, because you're not necessarily classified as a leader if there's no one following you. Did you want to add anything to that?
No, I would just say, people say, well, that's crazy. I have a team of 10 people. They may be there physically, but how connected are they to the purpose and the mission and to you and the way you do, where you're doing things, right? And that's that people don't think much, about their source of power, right? They think authority. I'm the vice president of whatever. And so, I can do this. I don't have to do that. I can say this, whatever. And you're authorized to do those things for sure. But how much influence do you have? How much influence do you really have, when it comes to getting people's buy-in and, really getting them to be there, not because they have to be, because you said so, but because they want to be, because they believe in what you're doing and they believe in your ability to get things done.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think what rings very true is accountability, especially if you're at that particular level as a president, vice president, accountability looks different, right? It's not necessarily to someone in a senior role. I mean, typically you're the one that is, implementing the responsibilities to those under you. And you probably are only speaking to the executive board members or in certain structures, an advisory board. But what role does accountability play in sustaining leadership growth over time?
Well, going back to that connective tissue between you and, the people that are working with you, the work that are looking up to you, even though you're not accountable to them on paper, you are accountable to them when it comes to your behavior. Because if you're not doing what you said you're going to do, right, and you're not following through and, you're overpromising and under-delivering, that's pretty conspicuous to people. And especially when they're being asked in most cases, to do a lot more with less, right? They want to see that everybody is carrying their weight. So accountability is huge.
Yes, it's huge. And I really appreciate you mentioning, being able to carry your own weight, right? It's not as though that you're carrying everyone's weight on your shoulder, even though leadership can feel that way, depending on some structures. For startups, it's typically associated with the founders and the leaders at that particular instance. But for a lot of larger enterprises, you have different structures in place where the burden or the responsibilities are delegated in a different format. So it definitely does cater to that accountability. But leadership development is a lifelong process. I think you mentioned it's not some place that you arrive at one day. It's an ongoing process, and it takes different forms. It can be from a corporate environment to, family life. If you're a mother or a father of a household, and you have children, that takes on a different leadership capacity. I mean, where do most people start incorrectly? Meaning, if they're starting their career earlier on and they're progressing through the rankings, what would be advice that you would give to someone starting out to alleviate, perhaps starting on the wrong foot?
You said that very nicely and gently. Where do they start incorrectly? What mistakes do they make?
Yeah, pretty much.
I mean, the mistake is, or the blind spot is, that they don't really see leadership as something they need to learn, that they need to focus on as a competency or a skill to develop, right? And that, so there tends to be, under those circumstances, a lot of trial and error, and trips and falls. And listen, when you're dealing with other human beings, your business is trip hazards, right? And so you've always got to think about, your audience first, how things, will land on others, how your actions or inactions impact others, right? And to what extent that impacts the collective desired outcome, right? And so, people coming into a new management or leadership role, sometimes they're caught off guard, by the accolades and the this and the that and the responsibility and the bigger check and the bonus, whatever it is. But it's really important to prioritize and pay attention to how they're showing up and whether that meets the mark and where their learning opportunities might be as it relates to, what they're there to do.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate you mentioning that and just refocusing the purpose behind opportunities to increase your impact, right? It's not necessarily, in certain instances, yes, the bigger check, the bonuses, that's enticing, but it's much more on the greater scale and the collective desires and how you're really improving the outcome for the business. But when we get into this very sensitive topic of, the change in the business landscape due to AI, due to tech advancement, that essence of impact is changing the structure of businesses, right? Companies are discussing about removing, entry-level roles because they can be able to replace with AI. They're talking about even some senior level roles are being augmented, right, with AI. I mean, when we talk about impact, what do you see, right or wrong answer here, but from what you're seeing in your field, how is impact being measured now versus, maybe 10, 20 years ago?
Well, the definition of what impact looks like changes from organization to organization, right? Mm-hmm. And, AI potentially is coming for all of us, even coaching. There are AI platforms now for, leadership development and coaching and all kinds of things. So I think that, right now there's so much uncertainty around, not if, but when and how soon, this is something that I might need to pay attention to. And nobody really knows the answer to that, right? Mm-hmm. But as the economics continue to change around us for various reasons, companies are going to be pulling in and tightening up. And, unfortunately, depending on your perspective, AI is showing up as a solution for a lot of different things, right? And so I think that, this is just my own opinion, I think that the pendulum will swing, far in one direction, for looking at AI advancements, to address a number of different things, again, with some trips and falls, before it moves back kind of to center. Right.
Yeah, it's like a mass adoption in one sense or another, and then it kind of like reaches an equilibrium where, some people are using it, some people are not. But I think at the essence, it will never change, right? I think recently we had a guest that talked about we have to consistently remind ourselves that we're not selling to robots, we're selling to people. We're impacting people at the end of the day. Regardless if you use or you integrate AI, people are being impacted by this. And if we lose sight of that, then when we talk about impact, right, with the capital I think we're not going to have much of it, right, or influence in other ways.
People are the ultimate decision makers. There's no question, right? And there are some who are more accepting than others. You just, think about the simple topic of autonomous vehicles. You have some people that say, oh, yeah, I'm fine getting in a car with no driver, right? And then you ask other people, like, no way. So, I mean, it just really, everything depends on the audience, right? Audience first, always. And I think that, understanding your client or your customer is the first step in figuring out how far any of this can go.
Yeah. And I really appreciate you mentioning like the audience and who's being impacted by this. As we're thinking about like the future workforce, you probably have seen a lot of headlines about, jobs disruption and the future workforce and what skills are going to be needed in the next 5 to 10 years and all of this noise, if you will. But what I'm starting to understand is if we're going to be going in that direction of, how does these particular tools either reinforce specific roles or not, you and I both know that within every single company, there's a structure, right? You are graded upon a rubric of some sort or a framework, and you have to meet that framework to get that next promotion or that next bump in your particular role or in that particular vertical. I mean, if companies are integrating AI, you mentioned talking about coaching or leadership development in different aspects. I mean, how do you see those types of frameworks maybe changing or maybe not changing due to these types of tech advancements or maybe even the utilization of AI? Do you think it will impact or not?
I definitely think it will impact. I think it's already fluid, just because and we all are familiar with these, the dreaded 5-point scale, right? Meets requirements, exceeds, whatever it is, whatever the nomenclature is. I don't know that, promotions and increases, track that closely to evaluations now, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that more and more we're going to see the introduction of and implementation of new requirements, as it relates to, your job description, your duties and responsibilities, that are associated with AI, right?
Yeah. Almost as if there's like AI assessments, AI literacy courses. I mean, they're already integrated now, but,
Right.
to scope that's part of your job description, right? And your ability to adapt. But as we already mentioned, the people at the end of the day are the ones that we're impacting. I mean, just to take it back a little bit, a few years ago, you came out with the book, and it's so important that our audience look into that, because I think you have done such an incredible work. Do you want to speak to the impact of access denied and how that's still relevant today for leaders in this era we're living in?
Well, thank you for that. For reaching back to the book. It has even more relevance now, I think, than it did, even though it might not be, welcomed in the same way that it might have been 4 years ago because of the focus of the book. But the reality is, and you said this earlier, we've got to have an individual professional development strategy. Just like you sit, at a retreat or at a meeting with your employer and your colleagues, to strategize for what the next 6 months, year, 5 years is going to look like, whatever. We've got to be willing to do that for ourselves. And we've got to be willing to manage that, right? And it's a process of continuously contracting because things are changing so much, right? So the agreement that you might have had around something, in January might be very different now because of, challenges that the company is facing, or there might have been a change in leadership and all of those things. So you can never assume that, those things are etched in stone and remain in place, right? You've always got to be willing to, politely raise your hand and have difficult conversations around those things, and when it feels like something is a little bit off, it's uncomfortable. Nobody likes to have those conversations, but you have to be willing to do it because you can't let it get away. And unfortunately, when people yield to silence, you're sending a message of acquiescence, right? So if you're not addressing it, if you're not talking about it, then the message you're sending is like, oh, it's okay, right? There are no issues. This is acceptable behavior.
Being able to speak up and to voice those concerns are so critical. And it's definitely a skill set to be able to sit down and have those difficult conversations. And I know your book highlights some practical ways to attack that. And I'm just going to put on a plug. If you're interested, please reach out to Brenda Harrington. You can also get it at access-denied.net,
Mm-hmm.
And we'll also have it in the bio of this conversation for those that are interested in a copy of the book. But as we get closer to the conclusion of our conversation, what would you say to a leader who feels successful on paper, but internally knows they are not operating at their best?
Yeah. This may sound very self-serving, but, seek coaching perhaps, because it becomes a confidential, very personal space where you can unpack some things, right? It's not a conversation you can have with your boss. Maybe you can have it with your spouse, depending, and not even a mentor or a sponsor in your organization. It's something that you really need to, it's kind of like cleaning out a closet, right? You just dump everything out and on the floor, right? And piece by piece, put back the things that you want to save and discard the rest, right? And that's difficult work when you're talking about your career, when you're talking about your life's work, and especially if you're someone who's been in the workforce for a long time, and so many of the things that you have relied on over the arc of your career are just no longer serving you. And so the success on paper looks good. I won this award. I achieved this recognition. I got this promotion, all those things. But we're in a different place now. And if you intend to, continue to be in the game, you've got to be willing to avail yourself of more modern and contemporary development and, really become more introspective, allow yourself to look within. And that's hard because over a long time, a lot of leadership development was mostly focused on how much you could produce, right? And measured by output and things like that. It's not where we are.
Well, thank you for that. Are there any final thoughts or remarks that you would like to leave our listeners with?
Final thoughts. This is a tough time. And one of the things that is really important to prioritize. And you'll see this in a lot of, I'll say, some of the better leadership development papers and publications. This is a time to really prioritize self-care, whatever that means, right? And to just, give yourself grace. A lot of the things that we're called upon to do to sustain a level of effective leadership now are uncomfortable and they're scary for a lot of people, right? But you haven't done anything wrong. It doesn't mean that, the things that you've done over the years have not been good and effective, but chances are they no longer serve you and, the organization that you're with. And so it's just time to retool. But you're not alone. This is what everybody's doing if they're intentional and leadership is important to them and they see it as a practice. So come on in, the water's fine.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Brenda, for being on the Omega podcast.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.